In this lesson, we're going to remind ourselves of the commutative, associative, and distributive properties of addition and multiplication. We learned them in our previous lesson, but for this lesson, we're going to include variables as well. Here's a reminder of those 5 properties. We learned several more throughout those lessons, but these are the 5 we'll focus on today. The first 2 are the commutative properties, one for addition and one for multiplication. As you can see, the concept is the same. When we're dealing with commutative, we're always talking about order. The order in which you add or multiply something does not affect what the outcome is. So if I add a plus b or b plus a, it's the same in either order. Same thing for multiplication. 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2, etc. So commutative is all about order. The way that we remembered that before is that you commute to work and back, so it's the same either way, I'm just going in the opposite direction. The associative property, again, 2 associative properties, one for addition, one for multiplication. And associative has everything to do with grouping. So when we group things for addition and multiplication, we can group them in whatever order that we want, and the outcome is the same. Notice for the associative property, the order of my terms remains the same. I'm just putting the parentheses around different things. We remembered associative by saying that we would associate with a group of people, so associative means grouping. And the last one is the distributive property. You might see that the distributive property of multiplication over addition, we really just always call it the distributive property. And what that means is if you have a value on the outside of parentheses, and that's whether it's written the way I have it written or like this with the a on the opposite side, if you've got a value on the outside of parentheses and there's addition or subtraction inside, you can multiply that value by everything inside. So let's take a look at what that means using some variables as well. So this is the commutative property. Remember, commutative had everything to do with order. And so when they ask us to rewrite something using the commutative property, all we're doing is changing the order. So if I use the commutative property here, I'm going to call this x plus 6 instead of 6 plus x. P times 8, I would write as 8 times p. And remember that whenever we're writing a number and a variable being multiplied, I don't even need that dot for multiplication. The best answer here is 8p written just like that. That means 8 times p, we don't need the multiplication sign in between. Negative 2 plus k is the same as k plus negative 2. Remember, typically we're going to keep that negative 2 in parentheses. And then b times a is the same as a times b. So that's all to do with order, some addition, some multiplication. Remember, there is no commutative property of subtraction or division because the order in which we subtract or divide does change the outcome. The associative property, remember, has to do with grouping. So if you'll notice, the expressions are already grouped. I'm asking you to group them differently and then simplify. So for instance, on the first one, I have 6 plus 4 plus x. When we use the associative property, my order of terms does not change, but instead of grouping 4 and x, I'm going to group 6 and 4. I would do that because 6 and 4 are like terms, and then I could combine 6 and 4 to get 10, and that would be my 2 answers. So this is rewritten, and this is simplified. Same thing for part B. I've got 3 terms all being multiplied. Instead of grouping them in that way, I'm going to group them by multiplying the negative 3 times the 5. Negative 3 times 5 is negative 15m. So this is rewritten with the parentheses in a different spot, and this is simplified. The last one is the distributive property. And remember, the distributive property just tells us to take the number on the outside and multiply it by everything on the inside. So 5 times 2m gives me 10m because 5 times 2 is 10 and I leave the m. And then 5 times minus 3 is minus 15 because I would have minus 3 5 times. This one I cannot simplify because these are not like terms. This has an m, this does not, so they don't combine together. Next, I've got a negative 3. Be very, very careful when you're distributing a negative value. Negative 3 times 2x squared would give me negative 6x squared. Negative 3 times positive 3x would give me negative 9x. Remember that you can write that as minus 9x or plus negative 9x, and it's the exact same thing. And negative 3 times minus 4, remember I've got two negatives that are going to make a positive 12. So some people like to go ahead and leave change opposite here, and negative times a negative gives me that positive. Here's one of each for you to try, so go ahead and do all three of those and then press play to see how you did. For the first, they're asking me to rewrite using the associative property. So the associative property has to do with grouping. So I'm going to regroup this. Remember, the order stays the same, but I'm going to group the 4 and the 8 instead of the x and the 4. 4 and 8 do simplify to 12, and so this is rewritten and this is simplified. For my second, they're asking me to use the commutative property. Obviously, this is the commutative property of multiplication because I'm multiplying, which means just switch the order. And so it would be 3x. Remember, it's not necessary when I put the number first, the coefficient first, I don't need to use those parentheses anymore. And the last one is the distributive property. I'm going to take 4 times everything. So 4 times x squared is 4x squared. 4 times minus 3x is minus 12x, and 4 times plus 2 is plus 8, and that's my final answer.